The floorboards groaned under Thomas Parker's boot heels, each step a tremor of contained violence. He was a storm trapped within the walls of the house, and Rosalind was the last tree standing in its path. He wasn't drunk, not yet. This was something colder, a fury honed to a single sharp point. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the room. He tore a drawer from her writing desk, its contents quills, dried inkwells, half-finished letters to a sister who never wrote back, scattering across the polished wood floor like so many broken thoughts. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas. Rosalind whispered, her back pressed against the wall, the delicate floral paper a cruel mockery of the ugliness unfolding. He spun on her, his eyes, usually a flat, dispassionate gray, now glittered with a feverish light. "Don't lie to me. The Caldwell locket. Your mother's. The silver locket." It was the one thing she had of her mother's, a simple oval on a tarnished chain, empty of any picture, its clasp long since broken. She kept it tucked away with her winter things, a cold, forgotten comfort. "It's just a piece of silver. It has no value." "Its value is not your concern." He lunged across the room, overturning a small table. A porcelain vase, a wedding gift from his own parents, shattered on the floor. The sound a sharp crack in the suffocating silence. He was close now, his breath a foul mix of cigar smoke and frustration. "My father searched for years. He knew your sanctimonious father had a secret, a weakness. He believed it was in that locket." This was madness. Her father, John Caldwell, had been a schoolteacher, a man whose only secrets were the dog-eared pages of his favorite books. He and the elder Parker had been partners once long ago, before a bitter dispute over a land claim had shattered their friendship and left the Caldwells with little more than their name. "My father had no secrets," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "The feud ruined him. It left us with nothing." Thomas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It left you with the key, you little fool." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh like talons. "He gave it to you. I know he did." He dragged her toward her wardrobe, yanking open the doors with his free hand. Gowns of silk and wool fabrics she never felt comfortable in tumbled from their hooks. He ran his hands through them, his search growing more frantic, more destructive. "It isn't there," she pleaded, the words catching in her throat. His patience snapped. He shoved her away and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of her bed. He turned his face, a mask of pure rage. "You Caldwells," he spat the name an epithet. "Always so self-righteous, so full of your own honor while you bleed others dry." He advanced on her, and this time there was no pretense of a search. His violence was no longer an interrogation. It was a punishment. The first blow was a blur, an open-handed strike that sent a starburst of pain across her cheek and threw her sideways onto the mattress. The world tilted, the scent of lavender from her pillow, rising up to meet the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing the lamplight. "You will tell me where it is," he snarled, his fist raised. "Or I will tear the truth from you piece by piece." Rosalind squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a blank wall of terror. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was not an empty threat. This was a promise. The pale light of a Wyoming dawn filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the devastation of her room. Shards of porcelain glittered on the floor. Her clothes lay in a heap, a crumpled rainbow of violated privacy. In the crooked mirror, a stranger stared back. A woman with haunted eyes, a split lip, and a constellation of bruises blooming across her skin like unwanted violent flowers. Hollow Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878. 3 years ago, she had arrived as Thomas Parker's bride, a 22-year-old orphan who believed the wealthy cattle baron's promises of security and respect. Now she understood the bitter truth. The golden cage was still a cage, and the bars were growing tighter, sharper with each passing season. The beating last night had been different. It wasn't the familiar explosive anger fueled by whiskey. It was calculated, obsessive. The locket, all this rage over a worthless trinket. His words echoed in her mind. My father searched for years. The old feud, a story she'd heard only in whispers from the town's older residents, was a living, breathing monster, and somehow she was caught in its jaws. Her decision was not a choice, but a necessity, the desperate act of an animal chewing off its own leg to escape a trap. She had to leave. Now. Thomas had ridden out at first light for a cattle auction 2 towns over. He wouldn't return until the following day. It was the only chance she would get. With trembling hands, she began to pack. Her movements were stiff, each motion sending a fresh wave of pain through her bruised ribs. She took only what she could carry in a small valise. A simple wool dress, undergarments, a faded photograph of her parents, their kind faces, a stark contrast to the life she now led. She packed the silver hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, its bristles worn smooth. Then, her hands shaking, she went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the lid, the scent of dried lavender and mothballs rising to meet her. Tucked inside a folded woolen shawl was the object of Thomas's fury, the silver locket. It was heavier than it looked, cold against her palm. It felt like nothing more than a sad memory, a link to a mother she barely remembered. Unaware of its true significance, only knowing that it was the one thing Thomas desperately wanted, she dropped it into her handbag. Let him search for it in an empty house. Her emergency fund, $43 she'd skimmed from housekeeping money, and hidden in the false bottom of her sewing box, felt like a fortune. It was her ticket to a life she couldn't yet imagine, a life where she wasn't constantly listening for the sound of angry footsteps. She slipped out through the kitchen door, her heart hammering against her ribs, so loudly she was certain the housekeeper would hear it from the laundry room. A blade of wind, sharp with the promise of frost, sliced through her thin shawl. She kept her head down the brim of her bonnet, shadowing her bruised face as she walked away from the grand house on the hill past the church with its gleaming white steeple, and toward the stagecoach office at the edge of town. Morning, Mrs. Parker called Mr. Finley from his hardware store porch. She raised a hand in a brief, jerky acknowledgement, but didn't slow her pace, didn't dare turn her face toward him. The questions, the pity, the knowing looks, she couldn't bear them. The stagecoach office was blessedly empty, save for the ticket agent, a balding, world-weary man who smelled of stale tobacco. He barely looked up from his ledger. When's the next coach leaving town? She asked, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized as her own. Noon stage to Riverbend, he grunted. Connections west to Laramie from there. Riverbend. The name was a lifeline. She'd heard it was a growing town, a place where the railroad was bringing new people, new opportunities. A place where no one knew her as Thomas Parker's property. Riverbend will do, she said, sliding $3 across the worn counter. The agent finally looked up. His eyes, small and cynical, widened for a fraction of a second as they took in her battered face. Then just as quickly, his expression shuddered. It was a look Rosalind knew well, the awkward recognition of a man's private violence, followed by the calculated decision to mind one's own business. That'll be $3. He repeated, his voice flat. He stamped the ticket. Stage leaves at noon sharp. Best be here by 11:30. She tucked the ticket into her handbag. 3 hours. 3 hours to wait to be seen, to be caught. She couldn't risk sitting in the depot. Instead, she walked to the edge of town, to a small creek that meandered past a stand of cottonwoods. She settled onto a flat rock, the endless expanse of scorched ochre and stone stretching out before her, the sun already hammering the earth into a shimmering anvil. The town hummed behind her, a place of secrets and silences. She recalled snippets of gossip overheard at the mercantile. Terrible business what happened between the old-timers Parker and Caldwell. Bad blood there. Parker always claimed he was cheated. She had dismissed it as old history. Now she knew history had long, cruel fingers. A lone rider approached from the west, his silhouette dark against the morning glare. Rosalind tensed, ready to flee, but he didn't appear to be one of Thomas's men. He was a stranger, tall in the saddle of a chestnut gelding, moving with an easy confidence that spoke of long hours spent on the trail. He reined his horse in at the water's edge to let it drink his face, shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Rosalind gathered her valise, the movement catching his attention. He turned, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. It was sun-weathered but handsome, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a clear summer sky. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone. He tipped his hat. "Didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not," she replied automatically, the polite response ingrained, keeping her face turned away. But the man was observant. His gaze sharpened, taking in her formal dress, the valise at her side, the rigid tension in her posture. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice softening as if speaking to a spooked horse. "I'm fine." The lie tasted like ash. He dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a respectful distance. His expression darkened as the sunlight caught the purple swell of her cheek. It wasn't pity she saw in his eyes, but a flicker of controlled anger, quickly banked and replaced by a quiet compassion that was somehow more unnerving. "Name's Samuel Donovan," he said. "I've got water and some jerky if you're hungry." She hesitated. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. But there was a directness about him, a steadiness in his gaze that was disarming. "Rosalind Parker," she replied. "And thank you, but I'm not hungry." He nodded, not pressing. "You waiting on someone, Mrs. Parker?" "The noon stage." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Samuel glanced at the sun. "That's a fair piece to wait." He didn't ask why she was waiting here alone, instead of at the depot. He seemed to understand, without being told. He walked into town a few minutes later, leading his horse, leaving her to her solitude. An hour later, as the sun climbed higher, a wagon rumbled down the track from town. It was Samuel Donovan. He pulled up a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Parker," he called out. "I have some business with the land office here. Looks like it'll take me a day or two. My partner is taking the wagon onto Riverbend this morning. He's a good man, family man. I can vouch for him. The wagon seat is a sight more comfortable than the stage, and you'd have the company of a decent fellow. No charge, of course." Rosalind stared at him. It was a lifeline, but it felt too convenient. Thomas's men would be watching the stage depot. A private wagon was a less obvious mode of escape. But what if this man worked for Thomas? What if this was a trap? Her mind raced, weighing the devil she knew against the one she didn't. The man's eyes were steady as offer, straightforward. It felt genuine. And the thought of sitting in the open at the stage depot for another 2 hours sent a fresh spike of fear through her. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice tight. "I accept." He nodded. "His name is Elias. I'll introduce you." At the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of dust and horsehide. Elias proved to be a stoop-shouldered man, with kind eyes and a picture of his wife and 3 children tucked into his hatband. He spoke little, which suited Rosalind perfectly. Samuel helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly covering hers. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Travel safe, Mrs. Parker," he said, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was a question in them, a hint of a story he wasn't telling. "Riverbend is a good town. You can make a fresh start there." As the wagon rolled out of Hollow Creek, Rosalind didn't look back. She clutched her handbag, the cold weight of the locket, a constant, unnerving reminder of the life she was leaving behind and the unknown dangers that lay ahead on the long, dusty road to Riverbend. The journey was a long, rattling prayer. Every rider they passed on the trail, every distant plume of dust sent a fresh jolt of terror through Rosalind. Elias, true to Samuel's word, was a quiet companion. He spoke of his children, of the coming winter, of the price of feed. His simple conversation, a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. He never asked about her bruises or why she was traveling alone. For that, she was profoundly grateful. They arrived in Riverbend as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of violent orange and bruised purple. The town was larger than Hollow Creek, bustling with the raw energy of a place on the rise. A half-finished railroad station dominated one end of Main Street, a promise of the future being hammered into place. Elias pulled the wagon up in front of a neat two-story house with a prim sign, Hullbrook Boarding House. Clean rooms, decent rates, Christian values. "Sam said Mrs. Hullbrook is a good woman," Elias offered, helping her down. "Strict but fair." Mrs. Hullbrook was a formidable woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze swept over Rosalind, cataloging the expensive but worn dress, the single valise, and the livid bruises on her face. "I need a room," Rosalind said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have one available," Mrs. Hullbrook stated, her tone clipped. $5 a week, meals included. No gentlemen callers in the rooms, no alcohol on the premises. Curfew is 9 o'clock sharp. Can you abide by my rules?" "Yes, ma'am." "I'll need to find employment," Rosalind added, hating the tremor of desperation in her voice. "I can read, write, and keep accounts. My father was a school teacher." The older woman's expression softened by a fraction. "The Mercantile is looking for a clerk to manage their books. Mr. Wilson is a decent man. I'll put in a word." She paused, her piercing gaze meeting Rosalind's. "Those marks on your face tell a story, child. You're not the first to arrive here carrying such burdens. Your business is your own, but under my roof, you are safe." Tears Rosalind had refused to shed sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The room was small, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a dresser, but it was a sanctuary. It was hers. A space where she could breathe without fear, where no angry footsteps would echo in the hall. That night, for the first time in 3 years, she slept without waking at every creak of the floorboards. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Mr. Wilson at the Mercantile hired her, pleased with her neat handwriting and quick mind for figures. The work was a balm, and the simple, orderly columns of numbers a welcome contrast to the chaos of her former life. She settled into the boarding house, taking her meals with the other residents, a young telegraph operator, a pair of spinster schoolteachers, and a traveling surveyor. She kept to herself her politeness, a carefully constructed shield. The fear of Thomas finding her was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her days. She scanned the face of every newcomer to town, her heart leaping into her throat at the sight of any man who resembled him. 2 weeks after her arrival, Samuel Donovan walked into the Mercantile. Her breath caught. He looked different without the trail dust, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt. He was even more handsome than she remembered. "Mrs. Parker," he said, tipping his hat. A slow smile spread across his face. "I'm glad to see you landed safely." "Mr. Donovan, I didn't expect to see you again." I have a small ranch a few miles out of town, he explained, leaning against the counter. I come in for supplies every couple of weeks. His gaze was direct, his blue eyes seeming to see right through her carefully built defenses. Riverbend treating you well? Very well, thank you, she said formally. And thank you again for your help. Your friend Elias was a perfect gentleman. I'm glad to hear it. He lingered, buying a sack of flour and some coffee, his questions subtle. He asked about land claims, about the history of the area, about the oldest families in the county. His interest seemed casual, but there was a focus to it, a purpose that piqued her curiosity and her suspicion. His timely appearance in Hollow Creek still felt too convenient to be mere chance. He began calling on her, always observing Mrs. Holbrook's strict protocols. They would sit in the boarding house parlor or take walks along the river, the autumn air growing sharper each day. He told her about his life, about growing up in Virginia, fighting for the Union, and coming west after the war, looking for a fresh start. He spoke of his family with a quiet sadness. They were all gone now, lost to the war or to illness. Rosalind found herself opening up to him in a way she never had with anyone else. She told him about her father, the gentle schoolteacher, and about the whispers of the feud with the Parker family. What was the dispute over? Samuel asked, his tone carefully neutral, as they walked along the riverbank one crisp Sunday afternoon. A parcel of land, Rosalind explained. They were partners, my father and Thomas's. They'd filed a claim together. But when it came time to register the deed, Mr. Parker claimed my father had tried to swindle him out of his half. He produced a document, a signed agreement that gave him sole ownership. My father swore it was a forgery, but he had no proof. The court sided with Parker. It ruined my father's reputation. We lost everything. Samuel was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Did your father ever mention anything else? Anything that might have served as proof? She shook her head. No. He never spoke of it again. The shame was too great. She hesitated, then decided to trust him with a piece of the puzzle that still tormented her. The night I left, Thomas beat me. He was searching for something. My mother's locket. He was obsessed with it. He said his father believed it held some secret. Samuel stopped walking, his expression hardening. The locket, did you have it? Yes. I brought it with me. It seemed a small act of defiance to take the one thing he wanted so badly. May I see it? He asked, his voice tight. Wary but curious, Rosalind reached into her handbag and pulled it out. The silver was tarnished, the surface smooth and unadorned. Samuel took it, his touch gentle. He turned it over and over in his calloused hands. He ran a thumb along the seam where the two halves met. There's a small catch here, he murmured, his eyes narrowed in concentration. It's almost invisible. With a practiced movement, he pressed a tiny nub near the hinge. There was a faint click, and a hidden compartment no bigger than a thumbnail sprang open inside one half of the locket. Rosalind gasped. Tucked inside was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Samuel carefully extracted it with the tip of his knife and unfolded it. It wasn't a document. It was a map drawn in faint ink with a set of numbers and a landmark she recognized, a rock formation near Hollow Creek known as the Sleeping Giant. What is it? She whispered, her heart pounding. I'm not sure, Samuel said, his voice grim. But I reckon Thomas Parker would kill to get his hands on it. He looked at her, his blue eyes dark with a seriousness that frightened her. Rosalind, this is more than just an old feud. Thomas didn't track you here to drag you home. He came for this. A shadow fell over them. They both looked up. Standing on the path, not 10 feet away, a cruel smile twisting his lips, was Thomas Parker. he was not alone. Two hard-faced men stood behind him, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. "So good to see you again, my dear Thomas," said his voice dripping with venom. "It seems you found my property. I'll take that now." The crisp autumn air crackled with menace. The idyllic peace of Riverbend shattered like glass. Samuel moved instinctively, placing himself between Rosalind and her husband, his hand dropping to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his side. "She's not your property, Parker," Samuel said, his voice dangerously low. "And you're not taking anything." Thomas's smile widened a predator's grin. "Oh, I think I am. You see, I believe that little trinket proves my family's claim to the Black Fork Valley, a claim your father, the righteous John Caldwell, stole from mine." He shifted his gaze to Rosalind, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "He ruined us. And you, my dear wife, are going to help me take back what is rightfully mine." Samuel didn't flinch. He met Thomas's gaze, and in that moment, Rosalind saw the quiet rancher disappear, replaced by someone else. A man who was no stranger to violence, a man with secrets of his own. "This feud is older than you know, Parker," Samuel said, his voice as hard as granite. "And it involves more families than just yours and hers." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "And what would you know about it?" A grim smile touched Samuel's lips. "My father was the lawman who investigated your father's dispute 20 years ago. The one they ran out of the territory on trumped-up charges when he got too close to the truth." He drew his pistol in a single fluid motion. "My name is Samuel Donovan, and I've come to Riverbend to finish what he started." The revelation hung in the air, heavier than the coming winter. Thomas's predatory smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then rage. "Donovan," he spat. "That meddling fool's son. I should have known." "He knew your father was the swindler," Samuel said, his voice level, his aim steady. "He just couldn't prove it before your father's money bought the right people." Thomas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "History is written by the winners, Donovan. A lesson your father learned the hard way." He gestured with his chin toward Rosalind. "Give me the locket, wife, or my friends here will be forced to teach Mr. Donovan another harsh lesson." Rosalind's hand trembled, the tiny cryptic map clutched in her palm. Her mind raced. Give it to him, and he might let them live. But he would win. Her father's name would remain tarnished forever. Refuse, and the idyllic afternoon would end in blood. Before she could move, a voice boomed from down the path. "Parker, you're a long way from home." It was Sheriff Miller, a stout, deliberate man, flanked by two deputies. Mr. Wilson, the mercantile owner, stood behind them, his face pale but resolute. He must have seen Thomas arrive in town and fetch the law. Thomas's face contorted in a snarl. "This is a private domestic matter, Sheriff." "Doesn't look that way to me." Miller replied, his gaze taking in the drawn weapons and Rosalind's terrified expression. "Looks like you're menacing a citizen of my town. I'd advise you and your hired muscle to holster your weapons and move along." For a tense moment, no one moved. The river whispered past, oblivious. Then, with a look of pure hatred directed at Rosalind, Thomas slowly raised his hands. His men followed suit. "This isn't over," he hissed at her, the promise of venomous serpent in the quiet air. Sheriff Miller escorted a protesting Thomas and his men to the edge of town with a stern warning not to return. As they disappeared from view, the tension finally broke. Rosalind's knees felt weak, and she leaned against Samuel for support. He holstered his pistol, his arm coming around her protectively. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, his voice urgent. He gently took the map from her trembling fingers and folded it tucking it securely into his shirt pocket. He won't give up. Now that he knows what the locket holds, he'll be back. They returned to the boarding house, where a grim-faced Mrs. Holbrook ushered them into her private parlor. The news of Thomas's arrival had already swept through the small town. Samuel quickly explained the situation, the locket, the map, his own identity, as the son of the disgraced lawman. Mrs. Holbrook listened, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. "He won't get her," she declared. "This town looks after its own." But Thomas Parker's influence was long his purse deep. The next morning, a different man wore the sheriff's star. A man named Tyrrell, a hired gun with cold eyes and a reputation for enforcing the will of the highest bidder, had ridden into town overnight with a dozen men. He claimed to have a warrant from Hollow Creek for Rosalind's arrest for theft. Thomas was claiming she had stolen the locket and a substantial sum of money. Sheriff Miller was locked in his own jail, accused of obstructing justice. Riverbend had been bought. "We have to leave," Samuel said, his face grim. They were fugitives in the one place Rosalind had felt safe. "He's turning the town against you, making it look like you're the criminal." "Where can we go?" Rosalind asked, despair creeping into her voice. "My ranch is too obvious." "He'll look there first," Samuel reasoned. "We need to understand what this map leads to. It's our only leverage." Under the cover of darkness, they slipped out of the boarding house, Mrs. Holbrook creating a diversion by loudly accusing one of her other boarders of stealing her prize-winning preserves. They made their way to the livery, where Elias, loyal to Samuel, had 2 horses saddled and ready. They rode east back toward the shadow of Hollow Creek, the map their only guide. The numbers on it, Samuel surmised, were coordinates, a location. The landmark of the sleeping giant was their starting point. It was a race against time. They had to find whatever secret Rosalind's father had hidden before Thomas and his hired lawmen found them. For 2 days, they traveled through the harsh, beautiful landscape. The blade of the wind was a constant companion, slicing through their coats. They ate jerky and hardtack and slept in cold, hidden arroyos. During the day, they studied the map. At night, huddled by a smokeless fire, they talked. Rosalind learned of Samuel's quest, a 20-year obsession to clear his father's name. He showed her his father's journal, filled with notes on the Parker Caldwell case, detailing his suspicions about a forged deed and missing land office records. "He believed your father hid the original deed." Samuel explained, his finger tracing a line in the journal. "Proof that he was the one who was cheated. He thought your father was waiting for the right time to expose Parker, but he died before he could. And he hid it in a place only I could find, using a map hidden in my mother's locket." Rosalind whispered, the pieces clicking into place. A wave of love and sorrow for the father she had lost washed over her. He hadn't abandoned her to her fate. He had armed her. On the 3rd day, they reached the sleeping giant. The rock formation loomed against the sky, a silent stone sentinel. Following the map's cryptic directions, they made their way into a narrow canyon at the base of the formation. The air grew cold, the high rock walls blocking out the sun. The map led them to a small, unremarkable cave, its entrance obscured by a tangle of wild brush. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of earth and stone. Samuel lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. The cave was small, no more than a shallow chamber. At the back, a loose pile of rocks looked out of place. Working together, they pulled the rocks away, revealing a small iron lockbox, rusted from years of damp. It was locked. "Stand back," Samuel said. He aimed his Colt and fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The lock shattered. With trembling hands, Rosalind lifted the lid. Inside, Nestled on a bed of dried leaves was a ledger. Its leather cover was stiff, the pages brittle with age. It was Thomas Parker Sr.'s private account book. And tucked inside the front cover was the original notarized deed to the Black Fork Valley, clearly showing John Caldwell and Thomas Parker as equal partners. Rosalind opened the ledger. Her father had taught her bookkeeping, and she recognized the spidery script and meticulous entries at once. Page after page detailed a systematic scheme of embezzlement and fraud committed by Thomas's father, funneling profits from their shared ventures into his own private accounts. The final pages contained a signed, dated confession. The elder Parker, fearing exposure, had forged the second deed to push John Caldwell out, and had framed him for the very crimes he himself had committed. "This is it," Samuel breathed, his voice filled with awe. "The proof. Your father's vindication. My father's too." Tears streamed down Rosalind's face as she clutched the ledger to her chest. It was more than a book. It was justice. It was her family's honor restored. A voice echoed from the mouth of the cave, dripping with triumphant malice. "Thank you for finding it for me. I was beginning to think I'd have to dig up this whole damned mountain myself." Thomas Parker stood silhouetted against the daylight, Terrell and two other men behind him, their rifles leveled at the cave entrance. "The book and the deed," Thomas commanded, stepping into the cave. "Hand them over." Samuel pushed Rosalind behind him, his own pistol in his hand, but they were hopelessly outgunned. "It's over, Parker. The truth is out." "The truth is whatever I say it is," Thomas sneered. "Once I have that book, the only story will be about a thieving wife and a trespassing gunman who met an unfortunate end in a cave-in. Tragic." He took another step forward, his hand outstretched. Now the ledger. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and impending death. A fierce thunderstorm, which had been gathering all afternoon, broke with sudden violence. A deafening clap of thunder shook the very ground beneath their feet, and rain began to fall in solid gray sheets, turning the canyon floor into a churning river of mud. The storm descended like a biblical plague. Rain hammered the canyon, and the wind howled through the rocks, a symphony of nature's rage. Inside the saloon in Riverbend, the tension was just as thick. Thomas had herded them all inside Rosalind, Samuel, and a dozen terrified townspeople caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, using them as shields against the legitimate lawmen he knew would eventually come. The saloon, usually a place of rowdy comfort, was now a tinderbox, the air smelling of wet wool fear and spilled whiskey. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the tin roof was a maddening percussion, punctuated by the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall. "The book," Thomas demanded again, his voice cutting through the noise. He held his pistol steady on Samuel, but his eyes were fixed on the ledger in Rosalind's hands. Tyrell and his men stood by the doors, their rifles ensuring no one could escape. "Give it to him, Rosalind," Samuel said quietly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's. "It's not worth dying for." But it was. It was worth more than her life. It was her father's name. It was justice for Samuel's father. It was the truth. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She clutched the ledger tighter. A flash of lightning illuminated the room. In a stark blue-white glare, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud the windows rattled in their frames. In that split second of brilliant light, Rosalind saw an opening. Thomas was momentarily distracted, his eyes blinking against the flash. A heavy whiskey bottle sat on the table beside her. Acting on pure instinct, she swung the bottle with all her strength, catching Thomas squarely on the wrist. He roared in pain, and surprised, his pistol clattering to the floor. Samuel lunged, tackling Thomas and sending them both crashing over a table. Chaos erupted. Tyrell shouted at his men to fire. Mr. Wilson, the mercantile owner, hurled a ceramic beer stein, catching one of the gunmen in the head. The saloon patrons scrambled for cover, screaming and overturning tables. Rosalind dove for the fallen pistol, her fingers closing around the cold, checkered grip, just as Tyrell brought the butt of his rifle down toward her head. She rolled aside the heavy stock, splintering the floorboards where she had been. She scrambled to her feet, the gun heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. Samuel and Thomas were locked in a desperate struggle, grappling on the floor amid the broken furniture. Samuel was stronger, but Thomas was wild with a cornered animal's ferocity. He drove his thumbs into Samuel's eyes, forcing a cry of pain. Tyrell turned his attention back to Rosalind, raising his rifle. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her shoulder. Tyrell staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed, his rifle falling with a clatter. Rosalind stood frozen, the smoking pistol in her hand and the smell of cordite sharp in her nostrils. She had just taken a man's life. The horrifying reality of it threatened to swallow her. But there was no time. Thomas had gained the upper hand, pinning Samuel to the floor, his hands closing around Samuel's throat. Samuel's face was turning a deep red, his struggles weakening. "Thomas, stop," Rosalind screamed. He glanced up at her, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. "First him," he gasped, tightening his grip. "Then you." She raised the pistol, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. All the years of fear, of pain, of humiliation coalesced into this single, terrible moment. She had him. She could end it. She could pull the trigger and erase the monster who had haunted her life. Revenge was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Samuel's choked gasp cut through the roaring in her ears. She looked from Thomas's face, contorted with murderous rage, to Samuel's, his life slipping away. And she made her choice. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about saving the man she loved. She didn't aim for his head or his heart. She aimed for his shoulder. She fired. The bullet struck true. Thomas screamed, a high-piercing sound of agony, and his grip on Samuel's throat broke. He clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face a mess of shock and pain. Samuel scrambled away, gasping for air. The remaining two gunmen, seeing Tyrell down and their employer wounded, lost their nerve. They threw down their rifles and raised their hands, just as the saloon doors burst open, and the real Sheriff Miller, freed by his deputies, stormed in with a posse of armed townsmen. It was over. Thomas Parker lay on the floor, moaning in pain, his reign of terror ended not by a bullet of vengeance, but by one of justice. In the sudden ringing silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and Thomas's ragged sobs, Rosalind let the heavy pistol fall from her numb fingers. She rushed to Samuel's side, helping him sit up, her hands checking him for injuries, her tears finally falling hot and cleansing. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and in his embrace she felt the last of the fear finally irrevocably break and wash away. In the storm's aftermath, a quiet calm settled over Riverbend. Thomas Parker and his remaining men were locked in the town jail, awaiting the circuit judge. The ledger and the original deed were placed in Sheriff Miller's safe, their truths finally exposed to the light. Rosalind and Samuel stood before the town council and the assembled citizens in the now-repaired saloon. With a clear, steady voice, Rosalind read from the elder Parker's ledger, detailing the calculated fraud that had ruined her father. Samuel then presented the original deed, its authenticity confirmed by the county clerk, restoring the Caldwell name. He spoke of his own father, Lawman Donovan, whose instincts had been true, his honor now at last vindicated. The townspeople listened in stunned silence, and their gazes shifting from pity to respect as they looked at the woman they had come to know as their quiet, efficient bookkeeper. The legal complexities of the Parker estate were vast. As Thomas's widow with his crimes laid bare, Rosalind was the sole inheritor of his ill-gotten fortune. The house in Hollow Creek, the vast cattle ranch, the wealth that had been built on a foundation of lies, it was all hers. But it felt like blood money, and she wanted no part of it for herself. Months passed. Spring arrived, washing the Wyoming landscape in a palette of soft greens and vibrant wildflowers. The trial in Laramie was swift. Thomas Parker was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and the hiring of Tyrell. He was sentenced to life in the territorial prison, a bitter, broken man stripped of his name and his power. Rosalind, with Samuel's counsel, liquidated the entire Parker estate. She used the funds to establish a trust, its purpose twofold. Half was used to create a fund to help women across the territory escape situations like the one she had endured, providing them with safe passage lodging and legal aid. The other half she used to purchase the disputed Black Fork Valley. On the very land that had been the source of so much pain and greed, she funded the construction of a new schoolhouse, larger and better equipped than any in the county. It was named the Caldwell-Donovan School, a monument not to a feud, but to the enduring power of truth and honor. One warm summer evening, nearly a year after the confrontation in the saloon, Rosalind stood with Samuel on a hill overlooking the school. A bell newly hung in its steeple gleamed in the setting sun. The sounds of children's laughter drifted up from the town below. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her hand resting on Samuel's arm. They were to be married in the new church next month. "What you've built is more than just a school, Rosalind," he said, his voice full of pride and love. "You've built a future." The day before, a final package had arrived from the lawyer, settling the Parker estate. Among the elder Parker's personal effects, a sealed letter had been found addressed to his son Thomas. It was a deathbed confession, written in a shaky hand, filled with a rambling mixture of guilt and justification, admitting to every detail of the fraud and the framing of John Caldwell. It was the final emotional closure they hadn't known they needed, a final ghost laid to rest. Rosalind turned to Samuel, her heart full. The bruises had long since faded, but the memory of them had forged her into someone stronger, someone who understood the difference between revenge and justice, between surviving and living. She had found her place not just with this good and honorable man, but within a community that had stood by her. "My father once wrote to me," she said, her gaze fixed on the valley below, now a symbol of hope. "He said that the darkest night cannot extinguish the smallest flame." He was right. Samuel drew her close, his arms a familiar welcome shelter. "You were never a small flame, Rosalind," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "You were the dawn." They stood together, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch across the vast Wyoming sky. Two souls reforged in the crucible of the past, their future as open and promising as the land before them.